it's your boy Phoenix here. How's everybody doing? Making another Destiny 2 video today for you. I just want to thank you guys really quick so much for the traction that I've seen on the raid guide that I put about a month ago. It was my first real shot at a big video, first actual video I really put any effort into editing, and it's done quite well for being such a tiny channel. I want to thank you guys for that so much. It's really awesome to see people have at least watched it in the first place. And with that being said, I'd like to discuss today a new topic, and that would be strikes. Recently in the Destiny community, the past couple seasons, strikes have become a focal point for many, as a lot of people have come to think that strikes are lackluster, they're kind of boring, there's no real loot incentive to run them. They've kind of become this copy paste activity that we just go into every once in a while for bounties or for whatever else a quest requires, instead of being a enjoyable, interesting, and fun thing to do within Destiny. So I want to discuss that a little bit. A lot of people have put their own input in all over YouTube, all over Twitch, on what they think could be done to improve the state of strikes within the current game. However, I'd like to put on my own piece, because I feel a lot of these points and a lot of these ideas actually miss the mark. While they're not in any way wrong and they would be beneficial, I think there's more to it than that. I think there's a far deeper problem that strikes have as a whole that I think Bungie should address, and I'd like to throw it out there and get the discussion, see what people think, because you never know, someone might have an even better idea than I do, or might be able to add something to my idea that would just make it a better solution. So that being said, I want to start off with, what are the things that we already think would improve them and maybe where they miss. To start this, I'm not really going to openly too deeply discuss what other people think, because I want to mainly spend time on what I think. So just to recap, some of the main basic points that most other people talk about with strikes is: 1, strike specific loot; 2, the modifier metagame that surrounds the nightfall; and 3 is the playlist specific reputation and weapons and loot pools that you can go after. While all of these things I think are absolutely good for the game, having particular loot and where you can go after just for playing strikes, having a more deep and interesting kind of jostled up metagame within Nightfalls, with having more modifiers than we even do now that are more specific, more serious, is a great thing. Having strike specific loot come back is a fantastic thing, to have something to always anticipate at the end of the strike. My problem with Destiny 2 strikes is not the metagame that surrounds it. That's not my issue. I, as a player, more and more find myself more bothered by the way the playlist itself actually plays than I do with the loot surrounding it. Sometimes I think Destiny and Bungie make too many guns and don't spend enough time focusing on making strikes themselves more fun. I'd rather have less guns and have fewer guns that I truly love and am very interested in, and bring them into a playlist that is more developed, more polished, more interesting to run them in, than just to get more guns that will go in my vault. So I want to start off with my first idea here, and that is the ending of strikes. This kind of ties into the idea of having strike specific loot, but I even think that's a little weak. Having one piece of gear or weapon or whatever to go after at the end of any strike is great. It will keep you running that strike for a while, but once you're done with that strike and you get that piece of loot, then you won't go back and play it again. That strike itself loses any type of value. What if we took strikes, and instead of having one singular boss at the end, we had a strike where there was multiple rotating bosses at the end? So that way, when you ran it, you never had the same boss the next time. In strikes in Destiny, the first time you run them, it's normally tied to a campaign. It's story based, like the Glassway. Aramis opened up the portal, the Vex are coming through, they're trying to take over the world, blah, 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 blah. The second time you run it, in the 3rd and the 5th and the 7th and the 20th and the 50th and the 100th, the story is different. The Vex are trying to give another incursion. The portal's still open, they're trying again. What if the Vex didn't send a Hydra every time? What if they sent through a Harpy, a Wyvern, a Minotaur? What if they sent through different bosses in the same strike? That would allow the ending of the strike to be dynamic. It could be different. That would make it more interesting just gameplay wise. In the Vanguard Heroic Strike playlist, you get a random boss each time you go. In the Nightfall playlist, you get a certain one for each week. And each one of those bosses had a particular piece of loot that was only attached to them. So a problem we've been having recently with Bungie too, and I'll add this in here as well, is Bungie's only making 1 or 2 strikes of content release. Okay, well, if they're only making 1 or 2 and they don't have time to make another 4 or 5 like people would like them to do, what if we made 1 strike equal multiple? Let's say you take a strike like the glass way. There are 3 different ways you can go through this strike, or maybe only even 2. Each time you run, you get a random path through it. You go to the right, and then the other time you go to the left, and it kind of just happens randomly. At the end of that strike, you get a random Vex boss, one that can be tied to the story, one that is interesting, one that maybe has a type of mechanic that goes to it, particularly that you have to solve and do while you're fighting. That way, every time you ran the strike was always different, refreshing, new. It was never the same thing twice, per se. And then when the Nightfall comes around for the week, we get the Glassway strike. But this week, instead of getting the Glassway with the Minotaur, you get it with the Wyvern, or you get it with the Hydra, or you get it with something else entirely, a gigantic Hobgoblin that would have a new mechanic and a new way of playing that would make the boss dynamic. So 2 weeks later, you could run the Strange Strike again, but have an entirely different boss with an entirely different outcome and a new piece of gear to search for. Maybe you take Navota's strike, and instead of it being Navota 1 week, you have a Hive Knight, and then the next week there's a Hive Ogre, and then the next week there's a gigantic Acolyte or something. And each time you play for the strike specific loot, you get a different piece of armor that fit out an entire Hive set. That way you always had something to chase after that wasn't the same thing every week, that could always be implemented on further. Now, let's say you change strikes to have multiple bosses and they have more than 1 route through them, which would effectively allow you to use the same strike multiple times, which would make it easier for Bungie to only make 2 strikes as a content release. But you could also, as the year goes on, add ornaments and or more armor to each one of those bosses if you wanted the strikes to persist through the year. This allows for strikes to be far more effective at doing what we want them to do while making them not the same stale thing every single time. The reason I come up with this concept is because in D1, while strikes were better with more modifiers and the strike specific loot and all those things, people still complained that strikes were boring. They were monotonous. You'd run them over and over. It would be the same thing every time, taking 5 minutes, go through, burn the boss, and move on. And you would run them and run them and run them again. You only have so many strikes in the game. We can't make a million. We can't also have one come out every 2 weeks. That's clearly impossible in almost any capacity. So what if we took 1 strike and that came out in the beginning of the season with the campaign, and then 3-4 weeks later, that strike came back with a new boss. And then the next season, that strike came back again with a new boss and a new route and a new piece of armor to chase. So by the end of the year, you'd have that full night set, or the full Hive set, if you chased it hard enough, and making 1 strike give a lot more content than what they do now. This, to me, allows strikes to hit multiple birds with 1 stone. You're not just making them have more incentive to show up. You're not just giving them more interesting ways of going about them in a Nightfall where the modifiers randomly click and you just have to play them differently. It also makes each strike dynamic, different, changing, and never the same. Always providing a different type of feeling to it. You're not just fighting Navota for the 18th time this year in 2 weeks. You're fighting a whole different boss with a different mechanic that makes it more interesting. And I want to touch really quick before I end this video on the mechanic part that I keep mentioning as well. Dungeons are a perfect example of this. Also, the entire Shadowkeep DLC was as well. A short mission that was interesting at the end, right? Dungeons don't take very long if you're good at them, but there are mechanics throughout them, almost like a miniature raid. Shadowkeep did this with the Nightmare energy. You would kill a Nightmare, you'd pick up the ball, it would allow you to do extra damage to the boss. What if every boss had a mechanic like this that wasn't super complex, but was required in order to take down their shield, to stun them, to move them around the room, to create something to deal more damage that would make the fight more interesting even on top of that? It wouldn't just be a singular fight. You'd have to do something while you're encountering the boss. Something not crazy, something that wouldn't cost the strike to become from 10 minutes long to 20 minutes long, but one that would make the boss not just shoot it in the face with whatever gun does a lot of damage. And we could, at the end of the day, if possible, maybe make strikes a little bit longer. Some strikes are really, really damn short. So short that you run in and you run out in less than 5 minutes. What if every strike was a little bit longer, had more substance to it, was a bit more interesting? That way you made every strike more interesting story-wise, but you made every strike more interesting to play, a little bit more of a time commitment for the loot you'd get from it, while still making it more interesting, making it dynamic, and giving you the incentive to come back each and every time to try and get a piece of armor. And if we're only going to be releasing 2 strikes of DLC, making them longer isn't a bad thing at all. We get more content out of 2 things instead of requiring 5 to 6 to 7 to who knows how many strikes we want at this point. People weren't happy with 2. People probably wouldn't be happy with 5. They want even more than that. So let's take strikes as a whole and make them not just have more incentive, not just have more reason to show up and play, but also the fundamental gameplay itself is more fun, more interesting, more different than what it is today. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk, I guess. I think strikes are not in the worst place on earth, but I think some things from D1, as many people say, do need to come back, but I think strikes themselves need a more fundamental change. See, Bungie has said a number of times that they don't want to go back to what D1 was. They want you to move forward. I think that requires some of the things that we're going to D1 to come back. But what happens once we bring those back? What's next? What do we do to push strikes even farther forward? I think that's when we need to change the way strikes as a whole work at all. They need to be more interesting. They can't be the same monotonous gameplay loop that they are. We want to make strikes fun, not just a loot chase. More guns, more armor doesn't always equal better game. Sometimes it's less guns and less armor and more about the gameplay itself. It's one of the things that makes raids so special. They're long, they're interesting, they're complex. Strikes shouldn't be a raid, but maybe we should move them a bit in that direction, making them a more integral, more important, and stronger core pillar of what Destiny is today. That being said, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Please make sure you guys write in the comments, have a discussion. I'd love to hear your input on these ideas. I'm always open to finding better ones, and you know, maybe even Luke Smith will catch wind of this and we can make some good out of it. So thank you guys once again. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that bell for notifications. Next video will be out sometime this next week or 2. Thank you guys so much again for this one and for the last one, for the traction I got. You guys have a wonderful time, and I'll catch y'all on the flip. Peace.